What was the proudest moment of your life? What was the happiest moment of your life? Now we all know what peak experiences are. Abraham Maslow helped prepare us all to receive peak experiences by defining the term. That set us up to realize what was happening to us when we first experienced peak experience. We're going to take a few perspectives on his work and provide an update on his ongoing guidance as carried out by one of his grateful erstwhile students, me. We're also here to have fun, so naturally we'd have to include politics. But all of that is secondary to your lives and how you can enjoy peak experiences more often. That's what we're really here to talk about. So, a little bit about me. I'm a consciousness researcher interested in sharing the practical aspects of my findings through education, media, and entertainment. Abraham Maslow, Abe, 1908 to 1970, hypothesized the theory of how people's motivations change as the more basic ones are satisfied. That wasn't half of his accomplishment. So imagine you're a newborn. Your motivations are mostly about the removal of discomfort. You're down at the bottom in physiological needs. As you become aware of other active agents, your parents, become aware of your safety, which they either protect or threaten. So then you're up in the safety. Then you discover they love you. So you've moved up into the love and belonging stage. All of that could happen quite quickly. Those are the first three levels of your life that will dominate a lot of your life, many, many years. Later on, you'd become acutely aware of the need or desire to be approved of. This obviously egotistical phase might mature into a self-actualized individual, but that happens all too rarely and is the biggest ungrasped opportunity our civilization has. Abe, later in his life, actually added another level on top, which I call self-transcendence, and he referred to as a more spiritual level, which is even more rare. Whereas at the lower levels of personal evolution, looking at, drive was always escape from some specific form of deprivation, not getting enough love, not getting enough belonging, not getting enough esteem. But now, in the self-actualized and spiritually actualized phase of life, you're still motivated by lots of things, but they're the kind of things you see here on this list: wholeness, perfection, completion, justice, and so on. Self-actualized state consider important and look for and strive for and try to have as much of in their lives as possible. This is an interesting list. We can't spend much time on it here, but of course, you're all going to have copies of this, and I think it would be good to look over this list in relation to yourself and see which of these things is important and less important, more important to you, and try to discover where you are in terms of all stages. Where in the hierarchy of needs would you place yourself? Are you already self-actualized? You spend some time in self-actualized, but sometimes in the lower states. Now, in relation to that final state of spiritual and altruistic enlightenment, from that place, Maslow said, these are quotes, "We fear to know the fearsome and unsavory aspects of ourselves, but even more, we fear knowing the godlike in ourselves." And then, this is a man of science talking about religion. And speaking about it as a scientist, he sees or saw, or maybe still his consciousness someplace, still sees the two religions of mankind to be not the people who go to church or don't go to church, but the people who have and use peak experiences and the people who don't, or if they have them, they suppress or repress them. And his definition here of peakers are those who have private, personal, transcendent, mystical, core religious experiences. So he's defining peak experience as core religious. This is after he discovered the top level. Easily and often, and who accept them and make use of them. And on the other hand, non-peakers, those who have never had them, or I think more likely, who repress and suppress them, and who therefore can't make use of them, benefit from them for their personal therapy, growth, and fulfillment. In other words, haven't we all had a voice in our head that suddenly gave us a piece of advice that it struck us as wisdom, like maybe smarter than we are normally? And it was like an inspiration. It was like an aha moment. It maybe came from above, or however we choose to look at it, but it helped us with our personal growth. That's what he meant by peak experience. At least that was his final take on it. Now, what about flow state? I've talked about flow state. That the term flow state was coined by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who had been the professor, the head of the department at psychology department at the University of Chicago. And he not only named it the flow state, but he also trained the Chicago hockey team to get into the flow state. And the way he described the flow state was it's doing itself, and you're in a state of playing. That is, you're having fun like a kid. You're doing something not to win a game, but you're doing it for its own sake. It's what you do, what you enjoy. There isn't a self-critic involved. The sense of time is totally different. Basically, you're speeded up compared to other people. Your ability to act and think in split seconds is better than the average human being at the average moment. Now, in science, they call that the aha or eureka moment. And in sports, they call it the zone. In show business, they call it being on, short for being on a roll. And the Beatles referred to this in the song Rocky Raccoon. But Daniel was hot. He drew first and shot, and Rocky collapsed in the corner. Over on the right there, you see, this is Mihai making a chart of when does flow occur. So his hypothesis captured in this picture here on the right is it comes when you have a fairly high skill level in something, and you're challenged by a challenger. Let's say if it's a game, or if it's not a game, it's you against the wilderness or whatever. You're in a situation that requires the best of you. And that's when you get into flow. You're capable of getting into very, very practiced, effective state while you're doing some activity. Could be playing a musical instrument. It could be sorting letters in the post office. Whatever it is, you're doing it really well, and you're doing it better than you would normally do it because you're challenged and it's evoking more out of you than you usually give. Now, Milton Erickson, another great psychologist, knew about the flow state. He didn't call it that, but he said in order to get into this state, you need a minimum of 10,000 hours of practice at the thing you get into the state in. Well, I can't believe in that because I had a few hours of practice when I got into the flow state for the first time. So I don't see that as a hard and fast rule, but I do see it as a clue that can help people, all of us here today, get into the flow state by thinking about what am I really practiced at? What do I do well? What have I spent 10,000 hours of doing in my life? But you also have to enjoy it. If you've spent 10,000 hours doing X, Y, Z because that's the way you make money, but you really don't like it, it's not going to help. It's not going to get you into the flow state. You have to be enjoying what you're doing. So this is a comparison between Maslow, Csikszentmihalyi, and my own cogitations and experience on this general subject. So Maslow, as we saw, now, you know, the psychology uses these two terms, states and traits. A state is something that changes moment to moment. It's ephemeral. It's a phenomenology. It's not a typology. Whereas traits are a typology. They change very slowly over time, character traits, personality traits. So when Maslow used the term self-actualization, he was talking about a trait. When he was talking about peak experiences, he was talking about a state. And then I've put in his final added sixth level of the hierarchy of needs as self-transcendence in this diagram. So you have the deficiency needs where we're trying to make up, we're self-protective, compensating, we're trying to get something we feel that we don't have. Self-actualization, we have everything we need, we have our potentials, we have ourself, we're just trying to express it. And it gives us more peak experiences than we were likely to have had in the deficiency states, which is not to rule out the possibility that peak experiences can sometimes occur in any state, just far more likely to occur and more constantly to occur in those higher states. Now, Csikszentmihalyi was concerned only about the changes second to second, the states. He didn't talk about human traits. He talked about normal waking consciousness and the flow state. In my own experience, I never came across these two guys for over the first decade and a half of my life. But I started maybe age 4 or 5 to have my own theory about this. I knew there was a place I wanted to be that I got to occasionally. And I tended to only get there when I was on stage, or then I started to see I could also get there when I was not on stage. I had a very unusual experience with, he was at the time a very famous comedian, Jackie Leonard. Nobody's ever heard of him in the last bunch of years, but he was famous for being the first insult comic before Don Rickles. And he was in my parents' room at the Hotel Brickman holding court, and everybody was laughing. And I was, I think, 5 years old. And I was sitting and watching and listening and laughing. And then he started to talk to me, and I started to respond. And every time I responded, I got a big laugh. And I couldn't hear the words I was saying. And I knew this was unusual, but I went with it. And we went on that way for a while. So I knew I could get into this other state. This was clearly the same thing that had happened to me on stage. So I was fascinated and maybe obsessed with finding a way to get there. So I would sit in my room and think. I would take notes. I would carefully observe my own mind. And that's when I discovered the observer state and what I call the robot. Also, I use the term robot and the term ego as synonyms. But when I want to emphasize the robotical nature of these normal waking states, I use the word robot. And when I want to emphasize the defensiveness and the compensating for inner feelings of worthlessness and so on, I use the word ego. But in any case, my normal waking consciousness state, I'm not necessarily happy. I'm not necessarily playful. I may be coping with something that is beyond my capabilities, or I think so at the moment. But I'm, not a happy camper. But the observer state was this other state where I'm able to observe what's going on in my mind dispassionately. I'm able to see my ego reactions. Oh, I'm having fear now. Oh, I'm having this now. I'm having that now. Oh, I'm angry, etc. And I'm able to understand, well, why am I angry? And does it help me to be angry? If I continue to be angry, will that get me away from or fix what's making me angry? Or would it be better for me to try to stay away from that anger, like turn it off like it was an alarm? It's useful to tell me something's going on that I need to fix. Now, how do I actually fix it? So the observer state, I think, is an interim state. Maybe Maslow knew about it. He used the term plateau experiences, which he described as longer lasting states of feeling of well-being. So he may have meant the same thing as what I mean by the observer state. But I wrote the book, Mind Magic, about the observer state and how to get into the observer state as kind of a launch pad to get into the flow state. And then, of course, the flow state has multiple levels. I believe the first level of the flow state is the flow state of the body, where the body, whether you're a concert violinist or an athlete or a performer on stage, the body, including the voice and singing and so on and so forth, everything you do with the body is happening perfectly, doing itself perfectly. Then there's a next higher state where the emotions are in flow and you're in a state of ecstasy and joy. In India, they would say ananda. Then there's a state above it where the mind is in flow state and you find you're thinking in a poetic voice, not necessarily rhyming. It could be rhyming, but your thoughts sound to you like Shakespeare, making sense. There's wisdom in them. And then you start to get into the spiritual flow states. So the observer state is the state in which you're able to observe the workings of your own mind without getting caught up in them, without them taking you over, without you owning the bad feelings that you might be having. And you're able to take your own last thought as an input, but not be hooked on it as necessarily true, or your own last feeling as being something that you're going to buy into and play that card. And I do believe it's a precondition for the flow state, but I have no proof for that. And the book, Mind Magic, is a compilation of hundreds of my mind tricks, mind magic. It's not meant to be magic in any kind of supernatural way. I believe this is all science and that all of it is science, including the spiritual part. So let me take a little turn here and tell you a little bit about my work in the field and how it comes back into the story of Abe Maslow. So in 1997, I had a company called Next Century Media. It did things in the media field like that had never been done before. It measured the television audience at scale by using set-top boxes, the cable company and satellite companies' set-top boxes. It did it with permission from the people in the household. 82% gave permission when it was explained to them that, for example, if you don't make the shows that you like known to the cable company and to the industry could make a mistake and take that show off the air. So, there's a benefit to you to know. Also, we had a program recommender that looked at the shows that you watched and recommended other shows that were like the shows you watched, but you didn't watch them. And people were very grateful for that. 18% of the time, they became loyal viewers of the shows that it was an early form of artificial intelligence, machine learning, the recommendations that we made. But that was based on a lot of prior work that we did. Now, here's the interesting thing. Abe was criticized for not being scientific enough. Basically, he came up with his theories out of his own peak experiences. He studied the lives of people like Thoreau and Einstein, self-actualizers, in order to anchor his theory in, something empirical outside of himself. But here, what we were using were totally empirical methods. We started with every word in the English language. We hired 22 coders because the Oxford Unabridged Dictionary has 22 volumes, each one quite thick. And we gave each volume to a coder, And we had them look at every word in the English language and pull out the words that met our criteria for being psychological words, which were all on a one paragraph description on a page. I won't bore you with the rest of this, but we eventually got down to 265 words that were highly predictive of people's television viewing behavior. Some of them are human values, some of them are personality and character traits, some of them are program descriptors, some of them are human situations, some of them are moods and emotions. And we collapse them by putting words that have similar meanings into 86 what we call need states, and then we collapse them into 15 what we call motivational types. And when we did that, we discovered our motivational types are shown on the right here. And the color coding had nothing to do with our work. We didn't have any color coding in our work. Our work would have had no color coding on the right-hand side. The color coding is when I noticed a similarity between our motivations and Maslow's. Practically every word that he mentions, we have someplace in our diagram. Not necessarily vice versa, but we have a couple of words he doesn't have, but we have a lot of the words he has. So this was totally based, this wasn't trying to validate Abe Maslow. We were just doing our thing. And somehow we came back to the fact that he was right. There were 8 types of esteem. There were 3 types of love and belonging. The bottom 2 levels of his system, in our system, came up as 1 level. And his self-actualization came out as 3 levels in our system: creativity, self-knowledge, and then self-transcendence. And I only recently found out about his self-transcendence level a year and a half after we came up with this set of 15 motivations. So quite interesting to me. So how can these understandings be applied by us in the audience today, and by me? We can try to understand our own motivations better. What motivates us now on a day-to-day basis? And are we happy with our motivations? Or does this insight that we're getting today give us some feeling about changing our own motivations, reprogramming ourselves? Maslow used the term meta motivations to mean that we do have our ability to choose our motivations, to program ourselves more consciously. I believe this can only be done from the observer or flow states. And the thing is, whatever it is that motivates you, you'll be more effective at getting it if you're not too attached to getting it. Isn't that interesting? Now, that's actually a psychological law that's been proven over and over again. It's known in psychology as the Yerkes-Dodson law. And what it shows is that the degree to which you care, your level of arousal, when it gets to a certain level, maximizes your performance. But when it goes higher than that, when you're really going to be demolished if you lose the election, it's going to help you lose the election. So you can be too motivated. Something very important to keep in mind. But it's easy to say, don't be too attached. It's difficult to reduce excessive attachment. So, what are some of the tools that are in the book? One of the tools is to use your imagination. Imagination can be used to vividly imagine, pre-visualize, first of all, the outcome you do want, and then how you will act when you get it. Are you going to become bloated and egotistical and brag? Or how are you going to handle it? And often when you imagine that, it'll be helpful for other reasons, because if it involves any kind of pushback from other people, you'll imagine that too. You'll say, well, Jerry is going to say blah, 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 and want to rain on my parade. And then, well, what I say, blah, blah, blah. And so the rehearsal actually has a lot of practical value, even though that's not the main point. But then do the same for the outcome you least want. And repeat these exercises until you feel a certain sense that you've burned out that need. It's, yeah, okay, if I get it this way, I'll handle it. If I get it that way, if that's what happens, I'm going to stand up to it, and I'm going to feel proud that I'm prepared for it. And I'm going to take it like a man or a woman or a decent, noble human being. Now, not today necessarily, but you're going to have a copy of this 15 motivation list. Look at the motivations list, and decide which ones you want to have. I mean, the one that RMT came up with, the one that maps back to Maslow, but it's more granular. Look at the list and see, what probably you'll see you're somewhat motivated by each of these things, but you'll see the ones that you care even more about. Often you'll find, and we don't have much time to talk about this today, but Mind Magic spends a good deal of time talking about how certain of the motivations you have were actually imposed by other people, and you may have outgrown them. And knowing that they came from other people may help you get past them. This is a slide that I used at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, talking to a group of high-level Navy officers. I showed them the Yerkes-Dodson diagram, and I said, now you're in action. You're about to do something. Maybe you're under attack, whatever it is. Observe yourself just prior to taking action as to why you're doing it. If you're doing it because you think it's going to get you promoted or make you look good, know that that's not coming from your highest self. You're not going to be most effective. But if you're doing it because it's the right thing, it's your duty, or it's going to help others, then go with it, because you're going to be in the flow state. So now let's try, other than listening to me, to do some other stuff, to do some mind stretching. This would normally be called meditation. You can call it that if you want. Concentration, introspection, it doesn't really matter what we call it. We're going to take 3 minutes. I ask you to close your eyes for 3 minutes and just watch what goes on in your mind, as if you're somebody else looking in on somebody you never met before, and that none of this has ever happened before. This is something brand new. Start from scratch. Erase everything that you know. Just take a look at what goes on for the next 3 minutes, and then we'll come back. Okay. Why don't we take 1 minute in case you'd like to write down anything that came up in your mind that you want to remember. Maybe you just want to put down a couple of words, trigger words to remind you of any thoughts you want to think about more. Or you might want to try just writing whatever your hand does without editing or thinking about it, just to see what comes out. Okay. Hope I gave you enough time there. So we're going to do one more exercise. Before we do it, I'd like to read you something from Mind Magic. Visualize the whole universe as one thing. Every individual of every species, every idea, every event, every moment of time, every percept, every lump of matter and energy, all parts of one thing. And when I wrote that, 1972, I didn't really know much about quantum physics. During the 70s, some great books came out by quantum physicists who turned out to be writing about the same subject, one way or another. John Wheeler, in particular, who taught many of today's top quantum physicists, talked about the universe as being one thing and consciousness being an integral part of it. I found that that was very similar to my thought that all that exists is consciousness, one consciousness, and that what we think of as our individual consciousness is actually the universe's consciousness as it manifests through us. One pool of consciousness creating all of these itselfs, you and me. Now, if that were the case, then it makes more clear some of the great sages from India and from all over the world who've said, going back thousands of years, things like Om Tat Sat, I am that. In other words, everything I'm looking at now is part of me, and I'm part of it, which encourages a sense of nobility, taking care of everybody, forgiving everybody by understanding what got them there, realizing that they didn't try to do something wrong. They're not trying to be wrong. They think they're doing right. Accepting what happens as being given, not getting mad at the universe because you've been dealt a bad hand. I use the word noia as the opposite of paranoia, since the word para means against. I use the word noia to mean, what if somebody's trying to give me a gift? Somebody out there, trying to help me. Maybe that's where those peak experience mystic messages are coming from. And prayer, accepting help from the universe, calling up cosmic fire support. Maybe it's worth doing. Maybe it's not just superstition. And we may, in fact, have telepathic and precognitive powers that we don't know we have. And we won't know we have them if we don't permit them to exist, if we refuse to believe they're even possible scientifically. But if we open our minds to all of these things as not necessarily being unscientific, just leaving room for them as possibilities, let's take that into our next exercise. So I don't know if you ever played the game Freeze when you were a kid. You know, you're moving around and then whoever is the captain at that moment says freeze, and then you just freeze and you stay immobile, but you keep your eyes open. But you're not allowed to move your eyeballs around. You can look at peripheral vision while leaving your eyeballs where they are, but even your eyeballs freeze. So if you've already started to do that, why don't you keep doing that? I'm going to read you something. And after I read you that, please stay frozen for another minute. And then I'll announce the end of the freeze. And I'll freeze with you after I read this. Also from Mind Magic. Do not move, but observe yourself not complete the intended act. So, that means you might be sitting, you're about to scratch a place that itches. Don't do it. Just contemplate what it's like. You have not changed position. You have not gotten up to get something. You have not responded to your friend, and you've not looked at what's going on nearby. You can visualize in detail what it would have been like to do any of these things. You can see in your mind's eye how others would have reacted. Having done none of these things, you can see that the world does not come to an end. Although your body may be uncomfortable, and your friends may wonder why you are strangely immobile. By having called a moratorium on undeliberated action, you have entered a deeper level of thought. The greater and the more continuous the periods over which you let such a moratorium prevail, the deeper will be the level of thought you attain. Okay, let's unfreeze. I promised in the title slide that we would talk about politics because, we're here to have fun. So talking politics is always fun, isn't it? So when did we actually, this was a question I asked myself during the last, during the very difficult, trying time that we've been through. When did we start thinking of ourselves as Republicans or Democrats rather than as Americans? When did that start? And I don't really have an answer to that, but we've definitely moved into, and just to put some context around that, in 1974, there was a magazine that had gotten started and was initially very successful, but it was going out of business. And I decided to do some pro bono work to keep them from going out of business, Black Enterprise Magazine. And what I did was a study which showed that the same ads in Newsweek and in Black Enterprise had 3 times the effectiveness against upscale Blacks, which I assumed that was what the study was going to show. And we did the research honestly, and that's the way it came out. And one of the questions that we asked in the questionnaire was, do you consider yourself an American first and a Black second, or a Black first and an American second? So that's the context of why I was thinking, when did we start to think of ourselves as Republicans or Democrats more than as Americans? And then I started to Google and search for things in our own American history out of curiosity about, did we always have a 2-party system? And I was pretty stunned to find out that in the first 20 years of the life of the United States of America, there was no 2-party system. It's not part of the Constitution. It's not part of the Bill of Rights. 1796 was when we started to have a 2-party system. And then when that started, there was somebody who was alive at the time who said these words of warning, basically telling us that it was going to split us apart. Party dissension was going to split us apart. And obviously, this person didn't want that to happen. Yeah, it was George. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries, like England, had a two-party system. That's what he was talking about. Has perpetrated the most horrid enormities. It led to bad stuff in England. Why isn't that going to happen to us if we go this way? Is itself, he said, a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism, and God, let's hope that doesn't happen. And so it was a very bitter election, 1796. I don't know how bitter it was compared to this one. And obviously, we're not completely through with this one. Who said these words? Every difference of opinion is not a difference in principle. We've called by different names, brethren of the same principle. We're all Republican Democrats. We're all Federalists. Those were the two parties at the time. We didn't get today's Republicans until around the Civil War, today's Democrats until the early 1820s. But he said, we're all both things. Who was that? Yeah, it was Tom, who drafted the Declaration of Independence. So now going back to my company, RMT, we've done some work. I don't know if you've heard of Simmons, but Simmons is a media research company that's been around since the early 1960s, founded by a guy named Bill Simmons, Willard R. Simmons. And every year they do a study of about 20,000. Now it's up to 25,000 people with a very long questionnaire. It's grown to a 132-page questionnaire. So they ask a lot of questions about a lot of subjects. And in 2017, we did some work together between RMT and Simmons. And in fact, it was right after Trump's election when we did this work. And the reason we did it was because there was already occurring fights within families of people who couldn't come together and have fun together without getting into squabbles. And what we found was these various things listed on the page here, both on the left and the right. The main point is all of these are American values. All of us care about all of these things. And in normal times, Republicans are tipped a little bit to what's in the first column, and Democrats are tipped a little bit to what's in the right-hand column. And when they tip too far, we call them radicals or reactionaries or extremists at any rate. And when they're tipped a little bit more toward the center, we call them centrists or moderates. But everybody cares about all of these things. And during periods of dissension and division, it's as if Republicans are the only ones who care about freedom, and Democrats are the only ones who care about equality, which isn't true. We all care about all of these things. And when we've got things that are happening in the world like the pandemic and the environment and the trillions in debt that exist around the world and how we're going to make a transition to, whatever the long-term state of the world economy is going to be, how we're going to do that safely when robotics means half of us don't have to work anymore. I mean, those are four big issues that face everyone on the planet. Everyone on the planet is going to have to work together to solve those things. And we were always taken for the last couple of hundred years, or a major part of it, as the leaders of bringing the world into a cooperative spirit. And when we can't cooperate ourselves, we can't lead the world into a cooperative spirit. We're going to have to learn to compromise. We're going to have to learn to reach creative new solutions, not just dig up old ideas. I mean, when we can't agree, Obamacare, whatever it happens to be, we have to find some new idea that we can unify around. But in a democracy, we're never going to have 100% consensus. It's mathematically impossible. Science shows that for everything that's a human characteristic, there's a bell curve. There's a bell-shaped curve. And there's people at the tail of the curves. So when you have democracy, which essentially means we're voting, the majority is going to rule, whether it's a straight majority or an electoral college majority, one way or the other. There's always going to be some people who are unhappy. Maybe not as unhappy as the situation today is like, but there's always going to be imperfection in the outcome. But we have to learn to live with it if we want to keep democracy. And we do want to keep democracy. It's the worst system in the world except for all the others, as Winston Churchill said. He was right. It's imperfect. We haven't found anything perfect. Maybe we never will find anything perfect. But this is as close as it comes. So let's preserve it. So my favorite science fiction writer, Robert A. Heinlein, in 1952, wrote a novel called Friday. Friday is the name of the main character. She's a genetically engineered woman. This depicted a world in which the US had split into 3 countries over irreconcilable differences. Her boss advises her, "You should leave this planet. For you, there's nothing here. The balkanization of North America ended the last chance of reversing the decay of the Renaissance civilization." It's a bad sign, Friday comments, when the people of a country stop identifying themselves with the country and start identifying with a group. And then he says, sick cultures show a complex of symptoms such as you've named, but a dying culture invariably exhibits personal rudeness, bad manners, lack of consideration for others, and minor matters. The loss of politeness, of gentle manners, is more significant than is a riot. As Abe said, dichotomizing, just looking at it's black or it's white, there's no gray, pathologizes. And pathology dichotomizes. Putting everything into 2 opposing buckets is a gross oversimplification and a dangerous one. We can't continue to demonize one another over differences. There are differences in the way we rank a list of motivations. When you look over the list of 15 motivations thinking about yourself, the differences between Republicans and Democrats, if you average them across the population of the United States, there would be differences in the ranking of those 15 motivations between the Republicans and the Democrats. It wouldn't be black and white. It would be a difference in degree. Why would we demonize each other over something like that? Thank you.
Okay, so